Hello and welcome back to another week of the War Report. Fashy Zizek is joining us again, but we have quite the packed news this weekend, especially in the Middle East, in which I think I'll let our friend Perseus take the reins on this one.
Hey, thank you. And thank you again, FZ, for coming on. We really do appreciate it.
Happy to be back.
So we had another eventful weekend. As you recall, just 2 weekends ago, the G7 was going on, and during the G7 event, there was a supposed alleged Iranian attack on Israel, as if it was an attempted. But Israel engaged in some preemptive strike, and that ended up taking the headlines away from G7. And the week after that, it was full of words of aggression. Israel claimed that these were acts of war. The Lebanese president and Hezbollah saw Israel's retaliation to those events as acts of war. And so Said Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, he said that they would eventually retaliate against Israel for the strikes that had happened that we covered last week. And so, in response to that, and this was a big media battle, in large part between IDF and a lot of these the Hezbollah media wing. And so what happened was that in response to Hezbollah's increased threat, Israel claimed that they were going to put mannequins all across the northern border along Lebanon, instead of having actual IDF soldiers as some sort of weird taunt. I think the idea was that Hezbollah wouldn't even strike these or something like that. I'm not. I never really understood what the point of that was, but they were public and adamant that they replaced their units with mannequins. And so on Sunday morning, and interestingly, the day before that, Saturday, was Nasrallah's birthday. So Sunday morning, Hezbollah soldiers on the outskirts of Avivim IDF base, which is in northern Israel, on the outskirts, they did fire two anti-tank rockets at an IDF military vehicle, which looks as if it would hold typically about four passengers. And the video footage recorded by Hezbollah of the attacks shows the vehicle was clearly being driven by people. Uh, it had, in fact, in the video, the vehicle performs a traffic maneuver. This isn't something a mannequin wouldn't drive, let alone perform a traffic maneuver. And so in the video, you can see that the two rockets do strike the vehicle, and so Hezbollah presumes that. Excuse me, before I continue that, after the vehicle was struck, an evacuation helicopter did come in and did escort these units to the hospital. And so Hezbollah presumed that they had either injured or killed all four. Um, but instead of, sort of admitting what had happened, Israel reported that no IDF soldiers had been injured, and the story kept changing. First, they said that it was mannequins who had just got struck, right? And this was before the Hezbollah had released the footage. So IDF was claiming that it was mannequins who got struck. It was just the road got hit, nothing happened. And then eventually, after denying these injuries and claiming that it was mannequins, Hezbollah released the video footage proving that they had struck live IDF soldiers. And then this is where it gets really weird. This is the part where, the life really becomes theater at some level. The IDF doubled down on their lies, claiming that they had faked the evacuation of mannequins to bait Hezbollah into attacking the evacuation unit. That is basically what Israel's side of the story is right now. It's really quite nonsense, because, like I said, the footage is really just hard to deny what it's showing. And so since then, the U.S. media has been largely quiet. Actually, I mean, I'm honestly shocked, but at the same time, it makes sense because this must have been either humiliating, extremely surprising, um, and they're treating it as if it was just a brief exchange of fire. But this was more than that. This was an extremely moralizing moment. And if you could, I mean, if, I mean, last week on the show, we talked about how Israel appears to be like a spider web that, Hezbollah and Iran have sort of shown these military uh, issues that Israel does face in its future, and I went as far as making the bold statement that we may actually see the end of Israel, as the Ayatollah says. I mean, it is a possibility, and what Hezbollah did was kind of show what they could. I mean, it's not even that they struck the IDF; it was that they were in Israel recording it from two different angles, striking a live vehicle. It's and then after that there were photos of Netanyahu being released that were allegedly taken by Iranian and or Hezbollah units in Israel. It was really quite shocking the level of threats that came out of this, but at the same time it's being sort of buried or sort of hidden away. But what was your guys' take on the strikes? What did you think? Do you think this corroborates that Israel really is in some precarious situation, or do you think this is something um, that may aid Netanyahu in the elections?
Now, I'll tell you something I find very odd about all of this. So, since the Iranian Revolution, what, 40 years ago now, the neoconservatives, the warmongers in Washington, D.C., have been going on relentlessly about the fact that, oh, Iran will attack Israel, oh, Iran's allies will attack Israel, oh, X, Y, and Z. But then we have this embarrassing, I don't even know what to call it, show by the IDF where they get completely, again, it's beyond words, where this happens to them, where Hezbollah does this to them, and you would expect the U.S. media politicians to be going into a frenzy saying, oh, we were right, the Iranians were a threat, we need to take action now. I think, if anything, that actually shows a testament to how low willingness for any sort of conflict among the American public is. But this seems like something that would be served up on a silver platter to the neoconservatives even, I don't know, 5 years ago. But now it's gotten to such a point where Iran has maneuvered itself, Iran and its allies, of course, have maneuvered themselves in such a position where they can do this without impunity. And honestly, taking aside any ideological or any of those kind of considerations, whether you think, oh, Iran is America's worst enemy, or oh, they're this amazing country, put all that aside. It's honestly impressive, just from a detached standpoint, just as an outside observer. It's impressive that in the past 40 years, it went from that to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were reports today too that Iran's going to be building the largest military base in Syria. So it's clear that the escalation is there's clear escalation. And the thing too that's interesting that you bring up is that it seemed like in the past Israel was able to take the victim position, really play the victim narrative because they were in a position of strength. They were, the hegemon of the region. But now I think what this showed, this attack especially, that if they are shown to be weak, if they are do feel weak, they're probably not going to play the same cards. And it seems counterintuitive, but this Israel is the most counterintuitive nation state
Mhm.
on earth. A lot of what it does doesn't make sense, but what is clear is that it has always played the victim card when it was winning at every end. at every deal, at every discussion or conversation with Palestine. They were always the victim, despite being the strongest actor. And so now, can they? I think it'll be a different strategy. I don't think we can think it'll be so obtuse that they will play the victim narrative in a time when war in America, support for wars is as an all-time low. I'm not sure they're going to be able to arouse the same fervor, and so one wonders if their strategy right now is to just quell,
Now,
is to see if they can just make deals. Oh, go ahead.
I don't want to drag this out too far, but you said, could we be looking at a post-Israel world in our lifetime? Well, something I'll put out there is, do you think the Samson option is just all bluff, or do you think they'd actually be crazy enough to go through with it?
What do you think about the Samson option, FC?
Um, I don't know. I'm gonna leave that to you because I feel like you really want to give an answer on it. But just generally speaking, I think everything Constantine just said is correct. I mean, it's not only that they are not willing to play the victim in a day when very few people are going to care, but how do you spin a narrative out of something like this that makes you look like the victim? The reason this was buried, I gather, is because Israel is supposed to be this open democratic state. It doesn't lie to its citizens, but it's just been caught. It's just been caught red-handed trying to do the same thing every state does, which is make a worrying incident or a defeat or something like that look not as bad as it is, or I don't know. It's just after decades of accusing all of its rivals in the region of doing the same thing. Of course, it just kind of looks shitty for them to be doing the same thing. And that's why they don't want this remarked upon.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, the Samson option is completely insane. I mean, if the audience is unaware of it, basically it's the idea that in a situation in which Israel feels its security is in absolute danger, that they will essentially nuke every major city on the planet with their nuclear weapons. I mean, if they're going down, the whole world is going to go down. Is the idea that um, I don't know. Will they actually do it? My big, if I had to put my money on it, this was Vegas. I would bet no, they wouldn't do this, and I think largely we will see what probably happened previously before um, when it was Palestine. I mean, they largely emigrated elsewhere, and those who stayed were Palestinian. I mean, it wasn't too different than it has always been. So I actually read an interesting article that there has been a lot more emigration. The country where Israelis emigrate most to now is actually Portugal. That's where they're going to in the highest amounts right now.
I would have
Which
suggested
is,
Madagascar, but whatever.
I mean, take that for what you will. It was just an interesting stat I read that for those Israelis that actually do move from there, the numbers to England and America are actually decreasing. The number that's increasing is Portugal.
Now,
So something's going on
I
there.
also want to throw something else out there in regards to again, this is all speculation, a post-Israel world in which, at this point, most people who believe in this will probably be dead at this point, if we're being honest. But the very Zionist evangelical branches of Christianity, their entire theology is shattered if Israel doesn't exist. So I, I mean, that's like what I know evangelicals in general are 25% of the population. I'd say out of those who really buy into the Zionist thing, good 15-20% of it. I would say definitely the people who don't buy into it are in the minority of that group. But that is one thing I think a lot of people overlook is if there's a post-Israel world, it's like a good fifth to a quarter of one of the largest voting bases in America is completely shattered.
Well, one wonders if neoconservatism will even survive Trump, to be honest. I mean, like we discussed last week, the narrative for war is no longer Christian, it's gay.
Mm,
Literally,
mhm.
And so, it's kind of sad to say, but in large part, there's a segment of the GOP in America that live in a different time, and that time is largely over. Or we're seeing it become over. And I think things like uh, increased hostility with Israel will be interesting when it happens. I mean, if boomers are still alive, these people will probably be slightly more activated uh, than other groups on this issue. But like I said, I mean, I perused all through Twitter to try to see who was trying to make a fuss about um, this Hezbollah strike, and I'm not kidding you. Outside of the actual in defense intel accounts who just report straight facts or report what others are reporting, there was nothing. And
And
I
even on that
there
regard, Spectator Index, who are usually pretty good, they were pretty scant on this. Granted, I mean, judging on who they follow by their sources, they follow a lot of mainstream American outlets. Makes sense. Sorry, technical difficulties. We dropped out there for a second, but we are back. But as I was saying, even accounts like the Spectator Index, who are usually on top of this kind of thing, completely scant information. And as far as that, I don't know if either of you saw like how much the Russian media report on it, like RT Sputnik. I saw they did a little bit more, but all things considered, I mean, South Front had the most on it out of everything I saw.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of security, war, intel accounts, there wasn't much else. But yeah, let's move on to our next topic. So the next topic does kind of fit in. It is Macron and Macron's wheeling and dealing. So we last week we brought up his aggressions, his posturing against Trump at G7, and speaking at the end of G7 to some reporters, there was an interesting discussion Macron had. And in the conversation with reporters, he essentially said that what we are witnessing right now is the end of Western hegemony. And this is largely due to burgeoning powers such as Russia and China, who are outthinking the West. And the West sort of appears to is going through this cultural malaise. These are Macron's words. And so he Macron stated that these sort of things were affecting the West in its exercise of power on the international stage. So this requires this sort of a change in view and a change in uh, direction. And so these were really interesting words Macron had to say, but I leave it to you two. What do you think about his words? Do you think this explains his recent moves in terms of buddying up with Iran, openness to Russia, slandering of Brazil, pushing around of Trump? Is this what is making him the Jupiterian president like he claimed he was?
Oh yeah, I would definitely say so. And look, it's funny because after the Yellow Vest broke out, I made the mistake that I think many of us did, where I thought his days are numbered. Now, I'm not going to say he's some fantastically popular president in France. What 2022 will show, well, we'll just have to wait a few years. But beyond that, he's made masterful maneuvers on the world stage to the point where, look, he's not like buddy buddy with Russia like some of the European populists are. Not that he's a European populist by any extent, but he's also not taking the very hawkish Anglo-American line that's been standard for the past 70 years at this point. And he's really establishing at least France or like that broad block of the European Union that he's part of as a pole in this new multipolar world. And not to get out too much off the topic, but you look at some of France's what they would call neo-colonialism in Africa. They're really setting up to at least displace the U.S. and Europe, as FZ said last week. But as for France becoming like As for Macron becoming like the world hegemon, I don't think any of us have any delusions about that. But uh, his moves are definitely impressive. And back in May 2017, when he first got elected, or this time last year when his populace really started to turn on him, if you told me that in September 2019 we would be in this position, I probably would have laughed in your face.
Yeah, I mean, if we can actually just focus in more clearly on what he said, because I find the quote really, really interesting. He basically said this: if our EU relations with Russia are conducted through the prism of Russian-American tension and aggression and um, their rival relations, it won't create, and I quote, it won't create conditions for a large-scale project for the restoration of European civilization, and that the EU and Russia need to offer a common front between uh, between China and the US. So he was basically referring to the new world as being a bipolar world stuck in a rival tension between the US and China, and that he wants this united front in Europe, which is interesting. Even just this way of speaking, who knows if he will succeed or how hard he'll try or what he's actually bearing in mind and what he's willing to actually put into effect vis-a-vis Russia. But for those, I don't know, for those people, and I do speak to them who are really Russians as well, who are really, really wary of this kind of rhetoric, I would just point out that at this point, it might be rhetoric from him, but it's not just rhetoric. When you have a whole load of Europeans coming from very different political perspectives, as you said, Macron is not any kind of populist, but when you have populists trying to cozy up to Europeans like him, establishment politicians like him coming out and saying not the same thing, but more or less the same thing. We need to reconfigure relations. He said we need to clarify relations. We need to pacify Russia and that kind of stuff, or we need to pacify relations. Um, this is all. This is all. I just think a very, very interesting trend, and let's see where it goes. But it generally is a good thing. It speaks to something good that all kinds of different political quarters in Europe. This is what you're hearing. We need a common sense relationship with Russia that isn't configured through, American, their status as an American rival, as this continual big bad Cold War presence. And I I would endorse what he said.
I would take it even further as an old time Anglo
Yeah, I
rival
think you
going
bring
back
up
to a 19th century whatever. But continue.
oh, I was gonna say that I think you bring up a good point with Russia and Russians wanting to be part of this larger European project because Russians typically do see themselves as a more Eurasian people, or maybe perhaps even an other Europe.
Hmm.
It's never been quite this
Hmm.
the Western Europe that we see that is largely Anglo and French. And so, and in that conversation, Macron brought up specifically not only China but India, how Russia, China, and India have sort of had to think in different ways, uh, and largely because of how history played out after World War II. But that sort of, you know, needing to be more creative on the world stage, may not look like it's bearing its fruits right now. Um, Russia or say India isn't like as extremely wealthy, but China's middle class has boomed. They have pulled so many people out of poverty into the middle class, and so they have benefited. And I mean, even look at a country like Iran. This is a country that has been materially deprived by sanctions for 40 years. It looks like it sucks right now. Yet, what is sensing is that uh, that's probably bodes well for later on. Because right now everything in the West is great in comparison, right? I mean, I think we would probably rather be a U.S. or Canadian or British citizen than an Indian citizen or Iranian or Russian citizen, possibly. I mean, not to say anything about Russians, but you get what I'm saying is that uh, when you analyze society by its material wealth, it's hard to look at places like China and be like, yeah, that place is doing really well. When it, in a more historical perspective, it does look like it is doing better long term. And so Macron, it does seem to want to get Russia from that sort of Eurasian uh, allegiance going on, and that he will have to fight Dugin for that. We'll have to see how Dugin feels.
It's actually interesting because several months ago, actually before during your hiatus, GSP and I actually had several weeks at a time where we would discuss this topic both on air and off air. And pretty much what we both said is that, yeah, Russia is covering both spaces. It's solidifying things with China, solidifying things with India, but it's also trying to make inroads with Europe, both with the establishment and the anti-establishment, with figures such as Salvini and Macron and Orban. It's all across, again, the European political spectrum, who are also eager for new partners beyond the United States. So Macron's words hold some weight, and uh, will they pan out? Again, time will tell, and I would refrain from making any really solid judgments on that, depending on how the 2022 election go, because French politics, I'll admit, I'm not the most well versed in, but it seems kind of up in the air right now as if Macron's political career will continue after this.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because outside of Macron, there's a leftist socialist philosopher in France. I forget his name. Who's like the most popular figure intellectually. And so, even if does lose because he loses the economic front, I don't think they're going to get someone too radically different, but we'll see.
Yeah, geopolitically, I'd see
Um,
France continue on the same track, whether it's some far leftist or whether Front National somehow takes
mhm.
control of the country or Macron stays in power. I think there's actually probably a consensus of them all wanting to go in this direction.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Last thing on Macron. Last two things. So, he met with Iranian heads of state for 5 years. Excuse me. Macron spoke with Iranian heads of state for at least 5 hours on the JCPOA, and basically what's come of this is that Iran and Macron have agreed to not work on a new deal, but they are welcome to working with the U.S. on re-implementing the previous deal. This will not go well, essentially, with Trump, who was looking for a new deal to be made. So I think what that goes to show is that uh, even though the deal is dead, it might be re-implemented by Macron and the Europeans on a smaller scale. But we'll see what comes of that. But Iran and the U.S. will not be meeting. That has been declared. Do you want to cover Brazil's tourism ambassador?
Oh yeah, this is one of the more odd stories we've covered in our times doing this show. But granted, that's a pretty high bar at this point. But Brazil's tourism minister and former mixed martial arts fighter Renzo Grassi had posted a video on Twitter threatening to choke French President Emmanuel Macron, as well as insulting his wife Bridget. Now, Grassi at 52 was appointed to the position last month by Brazil's controversial far-right leader Jair Bolsonaro. His job is promoting the country's tourism, which has been especially hamstrung in recent weeks, uh, mainly because of fires, which have been dominating the headlines, if you will. Now, he said, quote, Grassi said, quote, I'll ask you a question. Is his wife pretty or ugly? Would you do her? If you can criticize our country, get ready to listen to a load of bullshit. And also about your relatives, end quote, he told the outlet. He continued to say, the fact that he is sleeping with the dragon does not make him a fire expert. She is ugly, my brother. Now this is following last month. Macron called the Amazon forest fire an international crisis. He insisted that the agenda at the forthcoming G7 it should be the priority of it. Now, this angered Bolsonaro, who accused the fire of being caused by Iranian-backed forces.
What a fucking shit show. It's like Brazil has become the WWE of politics.
They've surpassed Trump. I don't like initially when Bolsonaro came to power, I thought, oh, he's going to be a serious populist. He's really going to crack down on the degeneracy in Brazil. Yeah, he's going to go with the Zionist neoliberals and some things, but he's really going to fix the country's internal situation. Lo and behold, this is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, who do you think would win in that fight? I mean, I saw pictures of the guy. He looked like he was still kind of in shape for a middle-aged guy, but Macron, he's young, you know. Those young guys are pretty fast.
Yeah, come to think of it, I actually don't know much about Macron's personal life. I mean, I don't know. He may be trained in some martial arts fighting style. So, again, I've called him the wild card on the world stage. He may be the wild card in the ring too.
He's coming off as the Erdogan of the West. Erdogan being this sort of like sharpshooter cowboy in the Middle East, just will do whatever he wants. It looks like Macron is sort of trying to get a sort of similar edge to him. But
Yeah,
we'll
and
see.
you look at the weight that both France and Turkey throw around. I'd say they're pretty comparable. So, I say he probably could do it.
Hmm.
Yeah, but
All right.
Yeah, I mean, my comment on the first bit was it was intriguing to hear him say, um, to hear him say what he said regarding Russia. But look, obviously, the idea that France is going to be some kind of that it's going to restore its international prestige and act as this middleman between China and America and Russia. And yeah, I mean, like, mixed results. Hey, I think we could say mixed results, because if some Brazilian nobody is going to relate to the French leader like this, and if members of Bolsonaro's government didn't step in to say you probably shouldn't do this, or we need to put the kibosh on this, or we need to really apologize for this, I don't know what that says for French prestige. Nothing good.
yeah, I would definitely agree. And it's actually kind of um, mind blowing that a tourism minister can cause this much of a ripple on the reputation of a major world leader. I want to go further. Do you know the context beyond the uh, feeling slighted by the international aid offer? Is there anything beyond this that prompted this video, or did it just happen?
It seemed like it all comes down to that. I mean, Bolsonaro took the attention that Macron was calling to the Amazon fires just as such a deep insult. There was that other tweet he had like a couple weeks ago where both some other minister in Brazil was saying that Macron should retract his insults. He was deeply offended by this, so it's really quite bizarre. Okay, that's enough of Macron. You want to move on to Trump and the Taliban,
I
the Taliban man.
Yeah, I'll get into that, and then I'll close out some Euro news. But for the topic at hand, President Donald Trump's special envoy for Afghanistan said Monday that the U.S. and Taliban had reached an agreement, quote, in principle, end quote, pending final approval by the president. Now, the draft agreement will see U.S. troops pull from 5 bases in Afghanistan within 135 days, as long as the Taliban meet certain conditions met by the agreement. Currently, there are 14,000 troops stationed in the country. Now, in exchange, the Taliban would commit to reducing violence with a view of eventual ceasefire to prevent and agree to prevent Afghan territory from being used as a safe haven from groups like Al Qaeda. So, I was skeptical when I first saw this. I figured it was just one of Trump's offhand comments, one of those things we used to see every week in 2018. But now that there's actual some meat on the bones and something to this, some actual more weight to this, and getting more details, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Hmm. Yeah, the thing that was really interesting, the report that was pretty interesting was that Bolton was not at any of these meetings. He
Oh,
was sidelined for all of this. And I think that says a lot about why this was able to happen because Trump campaigned on ending the war in Afghanistan. I mean, he was saying that even in his first year of his administration. And if you recall, he had this one. There was this one deadline on uh, troop levels, and Trump declared that he was going to increase troop levels. And he held this huge press conference. I believe this was in 2017, maybe even 2018, summer of 2018. No, excuse me. No, yeah, it may have been summer of 2018. But regardless, Trump held this huge press conference explaining giving the case for why the war in Afghanistan should end. He began it with, we've been there for so long. There are uh, soldiers serving in Afghanistan right now who were born after 9/11, who didn't even witness the reason why it happened. Their fathers, sons, two generations of families who have served in this war. And so, and obviously the economic costs, millions of people have been affected by this. But regardless, Trump did state these things, and then he went on to increase the troop level to like he put like 3,000 more troops or something. I don't recall the exact number. So this clearly was only possible because Bolton was sidelined. I mean, ever since Bolton came into the administration, Trump has become more aggressive in in his foreign policy, to the extent that Trump wasn't being aggressive at all prior to him. And so I do take this seriously, and one of the reasons why I do think this is serious is because Trump hasn't been able to follow through on many campaign promises that really mattered to his base.
but
And
GDP and
go
moving
ahead.
the embassy to Jerusalem, I think that's enough to secure 2020.
Mm.
Without the wall, with these red flag gun laws, I mean, a lot of this stuff has been largely demoralizing on his base, and I think he's looking for a win. And he realizes the only way he can get a win is if he puts Colonel Sanders to the side.
Oh boy.
Can I just say, I mean, I in principle agree with everything that's been said, but um, this is the war in Afghanistan is obviously a war that's been lost. Uh, the goal of what was it, Operation Enduring Freedom, was basically to unseat the Taliban. Well, the Taliban now have control over more territory in Afghanistan than they've had at any point since 2001. And the US, I guess Trump kind of sees no other way forward other than, a new offensive, sees no other way forward than to essentially negotiate with the people that America was supposed to be forcing out of Afghanistan. So the goal of the entire war has failed. I mean, the strategy hasn't worked, and so this is an American loss. It's just another American loss. It's another failure. It's just one more reason to suppose that you know just because America has overwhelming firepower, it doesn't mean that it can throw its weight around and get everything it wants. It can throw its weight around and it can cause enormous damage. But ultimately, if if you can't stand as freedom's sentinel, right? That was the name of the second operation in Afghanistan. If you can't be freedom's sentinel in Afghanistan, uh, what's the point of it all? How much money, how many lives, how much stress and political capital has been sunk into this war in which I don't know if America has done much of anything, and the fact that I don't know the fact that this isn't really talked about, it's kind of amazing enough that there would be some neocons who just want to stay there. Again, what for? It's not as though America's doing much of anything. Uh, it's just it's all a big shit show. Obviously, you should leave. Trump should leave as soon as he can. But I just want to underscore the fact that you know uh, America will be leaving with its tail tucked between its legs.
It's a sore spot no matter how you slice it. But you talk about how
Mm.
there's some
Mhm.
neocons who still want to drag this thing out. It reminds me of I think it was actually early this year, the piece by Max Boot saying, "Well, it took the British 300 years to fully colonize India. So if we just stick it out a little bit longer, we can win in Afghanistan."
Yeah, well, that's what that is like the main neocon line right now. They're not happy. Britt Hume on Fox News was saying today that it's a loss if Trump does this, and there's just no way to no way. There's no other way to cut it. I mean, after 18 years, the Taliban, like you said, have secured more land. The opium production has been increasing every year. I mean, I don't know. ISIS is still like existed. Al
Oh,
Qaeda.
speaking of
The U.S. is
ISIS,
supporting Al Qaeda.
speaking of ISIS, the same Taliban we
But
made a
just
truce
real quickly,
with.
the U.S. is supporting. Go ahead.
No, yeah, sorry, but just to make a point, like the U.S. made a truce with the Taliban in 2015, 2016 over the issue of ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, and then the U.S. is also supporting Al Qaeda in Syria and Yemen. So like every purpose of that war, the initial reasons for that war, just have never been succeeded. They just have not been accomplished at all. And so there's just really no other way to cut it other than, I mean, the military industrial complex made tons of money. I mean, let's just not even kid ourselves. They were
Mm.
dropping bombs in dirt fields because they were making money off each sale, you know? And so let's not kid ourselves. I mean, there are winners of this war. But they're not they're not public figures, so to speak. They're corporations largely. Um, I mean, there was theft. I mean, let's look at the opioid crisis in America. Where did all this opium come from? Where were they getting these opiates from? There seems to be this correlation between the increase in the opiate production in Afghanistan with um, opium use all around the world. There was actually an interesting take on how Iranian military that secures the border between Iran and Afghanistan. They that is probably the highest like drug trafficking area in the world in terms of the number of arrests and captures by a police force. And I mean, there could literally be an amazing. There's a interesting, cool guy on Twitter who made this comment. He said something to the effect that, I mean, they should make a Vice documentary on, I mean, on the level of opium that's coming out of Afghanistan. Um, and it is affecting uh, people in Kansas. It is affecting people in Nebraska. It is affecting people. It is amazing how this war has literally touched everyone. I mean, putting aside the millions of people who died in Afghanistan or maimed, orphaned, or what have you because of this war, but it all came back in this weird, crazy boomerang to where we're all just dying from this, and it really does have to end. This war really does has to end.
Yeah, and just on the opium note, that reminds me of Colonel Douglas McGregor, Tucker Carlson's military consultant. He was making the point when it came to the opium in Afghanistan that, yeah, it's a big problem that our presence there isn't doing anything about it. And he also said, like, yeah, it's coming here, but it's affecting worldwide. Yeah, it's going through Iran, it's going to Central Asia, to Russia, even to Europe at this point. At this point, it's like, yeah, I think they're the second largest in the world after Vietnam. The information could be a bit out of date, but one last thing I'll say on the opioid issue is, to the credit of George W. Bush, and I can't believe I'm saying this, at least he made it official U.S. military policy to destroy the poppy fields. I mean, that ended in 2009 under Obama, and as far as I know, Trump hasn't reinstated the Bush era policy, but to his credit, at least we did, even if it was at the bare minimum, we at least destroyed some of it and stopped it from going out of the country. But yeah, ever since 2009, so for a decade now, it's just been just cranked out. And a Taliban Afghanistan, as we saw in the 90s, didn't tolerate it. The Soviet-backed government didn't tolerate it.
Yeah,
Pretty
but
much,
even then, but you got to be careful with that. You got to be careful with that because I mean, the CIA was selling crack to
yeah,
like inner city LA people.
yeah,
So like even if Bush like had some official declaration, I mean, the numbers of drugs coming out of Afghanistan increased every year.
but I
The
I
war
will say,
start
like,
ever
there was
since the
there was a
war
massive
started.
spike from 2008 to 2009.
Oh yeah, I mean, come on, it's Obama.
Yeah,
And this
but
guy was doing cocaine in a freezer.
oh
And
boy,
that's what he said in his biography.
oh
Remember
boy,
that?
yes, yes.
That came out in his biography that he was doing coke in a freezer.
But unless either of you have any more thoughts, I'm gonna
These
do
were
it.
the dreams of his father. Oh wait, no. Let's. Yeah, let's just go to Euro news. I mean, let's just hope this withdrawal happens. Let's just hope it does.
Okay, so I'll start out with our good friends in the British Isles, the UK. The Conservative government has lost the majority after one member of Parliament, one Conservative MP, defected. He changed his party from Conservative to Liberal Democrat. So this comes after, of course, Boris Johnson wanted to invoke the royal family to use their powers to temporarily suspend Parliament. And this, of course, comes after fierce Brexit debates where he's saying, we're getting out on the 31st, we're getting out on Halloween. And now people are speculating that there's going to be another election because the Conservative government has lost the majority. Keep in mind the Conservative DUP government has lost its majority by one seat. So I would say out of everything, an election is probably going to be forced within the next few months. I would say there's actually probably going to be an election forced sooner than there will be in Italy. And I think Italy is due for an election in the coming months, but I honestly think the UK will beat them to it, which is honestly impressive, if anything.
Well, I'm looking at reports here that more or less confirm it from National Public Radio that Johnson is to call for snap election.
Oh.
So, yeah.
I'm not going to
What
speculate.
a shit show.
I'm not going to speculate too much because we still have an entire election campaign if those reports are true. But I think we finally might see Prime Minister Corbyn. If I had to take a guess.
God, I hope so.
Corbyn is one of the most like slandered people ever.
Oh, yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
it's amazing how. I mean, he did have that one bad photo op with Hezbollah because but let's be
photo op,
real.
you
Like, I mean, it is a based photo op, but in terms of his political career, it's not like it was kind of But we know that the only reason why that was bad is because Hezbollah is improperly put on a
Hmm.
terrorist list.
Right.
But aside from that, I mean, I have not seen a more calumniated uh, public official in recent times than him. I mean, his just very shallow support for Palestine is enough for them to just call him an anti-Semite, and it's become this bizarre shit show that in England between even like members of the Labour Party who are Jewish who are coming out in defense of Corbyn, and it is a really bizarre debate going on around him. But him winning would, I mean, him becoming prime minister would be good for the discussion. I mean, this discussion has to end somehow.
I mean, I see no way around it. As for Corbyn, my personal views on him, I made this very clear. I really don't care. I mean, I don't think he's what he's made out to be, but I also don't think he'd be a great leader. Now, admittedly, looking at the state of the UK Conservatives, I mean, hell, at this point he might be better, but that's aside the point. But yeah, I could see him pulling this off. And the other point I wanted to bring up with how maligned he is just for his oh, well, I think Israel steps over the line quite a bit, and I'm pro-Palestine. I remember they were trying to make it like, oh, he's an anti-Semite, he's also a sexist. Look at how women are treated in the Labor Party. I remember they really tried to run with that one. I don't know, I think about 6 months ago. But yeah, nonetheless, I would want to see him take power for the chaos alone.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I really don't know what comes next for poor Britain. Um, I, you know, I really don't know what comes next. I don't really see a leader sitting in Parliament today who could unite the country around, uh, because it's so disunited, around something like taking them out of the EU, which was controversial in the beginning. And I don't know, what you might see if Corbyn manages to make it to a majority, what you might end up seeing is, he signs a pretty quick deal with the EU for some kind of, I don't know, some kind of holding status, and it's not a no deal Brexit, but they finally back out. Um, yeah, I mean, maybe he'll have more success than the Conservatives have had. Who's to say?
It's a low bar.
At this point, just yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's a really low bar. It's like at this point, anyone saying no, we have to stay conservative, otherwise we won't leave the EU. Which, as I've said, I'm ambivalent. Britain's going to leave the EU either way, or it's going to be pushed out of it. This is ultimately a good thing for Europe, not such a good thing for Britain. And yeah, I don't know really how it helps them to just drag it out for years on end. But this snap election, given how the rhetoric is, and the fact that there seems to be a march in protest against some government policy every other day, I wonder how long it is before you see actual political violence on the on the streets of London.
Well,
Not long, I think.
yeah, I would definitely agree. But Perseus and I speculated that we may actually see a dissolution of the Union in our lifetimes. We discussed this actually a few months ago. Like, we compared it to the situation with Catalonia, how when the Catalonian
Mm.
separatism picked up in late 2017, so did Spanish nationalism. So, especially you look at the voting
Hmm.
patterns of who supported the European Union, who supported getting out. The Scots were very pro EU, and there's been, of course, several threats of another referendum. So, we may see a breakup of the Union in that regard. So, I wouldn't put my money on it, but I don't think it's the
Hmm.
most far fetched thing.
No, it's not far fetched. That said, I think there is still a general. I don't know what I'd say about that is that there's still a kind of general, at least as long as the boomers survive, there is this general feeling that the EU the EU is a kind of sacrosanct thing. It ensures a kind of peace where the memories of a really, really hideous war or set of wars in Europe, um, it, you know, for people who can remember it or who were brought up uh, uh, with it dominating their lives, it's just thinking about the EU fracturing and all of these little European states relating to each other once again on the basis of purely their own national interests. I don't think that really sits well with Europeans. I don't think it sits well with Germans. It doesn't sit well with French people. You might have, I don't know, like you might have uppity Italians and Spaniards, being mavericks on the issue or something. But I don't know. I don't want to say that the breakup of the EU is a likely thing.
Oh, I was more
Maybe you'll
talking
have
about,
maybe you'll have some countries leave it, but the core countries are going to stay in there.
yeah, I would definitely agree that the breakup of the EU
Probably.
isn't going to happen, but there's going to be a restructuring. We may see defections. We may see more referendums of countries leaving. But I was referring more so specifically to the breakup of the United Kingdom.
Oh, right. Sorry. You said union, so yeah. No, I think that's I think that's a definite possibility. I mean, with the way everything heats up, I think I've said this on the show before. I mean, the Scots. I mean, this whole Brexit has just been one more means of of bringing about a kind of Scottish nationalism. And you can say what you want about that. I mean, people can say it's very, it's a very effete kind of nationalism, desiring to be part of Europe rather than to be part of Britain, part of the UK, because it's not as though the Scots can have a truly independent foreign policy anyway, or it's not as if they can truly manage their own affairs. They're just one tiny country. Yeah, I think they could leave. I think that's very possible. In fact, I think it looks more and more likely.
And especially with
God
the
knows when
situation
or
with
if it will
the
happen, but
situation with the EU, with the Ireland UK border, we could see Northern Ireland hold their referendum. But not to drag this topic on too long, I have a couple more stories in Europe. So in Italy, it looks like they're going forward with the five-star and PD coalition. Now, this comes after an online referendum among five-star voters, where they gave input on the approval of their coalition. Now, it was much higher than I expected. I still expect them to pull it off, but they had 79% approval of the new coalition as compared to a 94% of the Lega Five Star Coalition, which admittedly had lower turnout for that online referendum, mind you. Now, out of terms of approval in parties from the past weekend, things are pretty stable. Lega's at that 31 to 34. Five Star moved up 1 point. There's not much stagnation. The FDI, the Brothers of Italy, are up about 3 points from the last polling period. So things are setting the stage for there to probably be another election forced in Italy sooner or later. I give it less than a year, but in the time being, people are reasonably concerned about the directions that they'll take, especially with the EU budget coming up. But maybe I'm just too much an optimist, but I see a more right-wing government. I see Salvini coming back to the forefront sooner than later. But beyond that, I also have some, unless you have any further thoughts on that, I had a little bit of news on the German state elections.
So are you still there, Pasius?
Oh yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I was,
Okay.
sorry.
I just want to say about Salvini. It's a funny thing when something like this, something so public, first of all, because it's very clear how he hoped it would go. But it's very funny when something like this backfires on you. Um, he he is obviously not what you would call a master politician. He has some good political instincts maybe, but they really failed him here. They really failed him. I think he just probably underestimated everyone else in the coalition with him. He underestimated Five Star. He underestimated Conte. The idea that they would just give him another snap election, uh, which in which he might capitalize on his recent popularity. I don't know. He was kind of expecting to push, that to be no resistance to that push,
Yeah.
and yeah, this is just rather sad.
For the past about month or so, we've been talking about this. My gut instinct was this seems like a pretty risky gamble. I would hold off a few months if you're going to try something like this.
Mm.
But then I came around saying, oh, the polling looks good. I'll look at that. He could pull this off. So then I was like, okay, go for it. But then, as it showed, he got completely. Again, I think overconfidence was his problem, and I actually addressed this when I talked about Salvini
Yeah.
even before the coalition broke up. Is the fact that he is good. He has good instincts, definitely good ideas, good policies on most things. I'll say, but he needs somebody to keep him in line. Conte, for better or for worse, kept him in line on a lot of things. And
Mm.
look, at this point, I think our best bet is, maybe a brothers league coalition might work. Who knows? But I mean, even if you could replace Conte with Di Maio as leader of Five Star, you might be able to get something better. But point being is, I think again, Salvini has faced the consequences of his actions. Lega is down from like the almost 40% they were at. Granted, a lot of that support has been absorbed by like other similar parties. It's more so shaking in confidence of Salvini as a leader.
Hmm.
And we'll also have to see what other major figures, what other major players come out of Lega. Maybe one of his deputies or so will rise to prominence on that. But point being is, yeah, it was a dumb move. It was a gamble. He lost, but I don't think it's over for him.
It might not be over, but it's a failed gamble, and it's sadly incompetent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Like you would expect better, yeah, better political intuition from this populist leader who like swept to power, and the left in Europe was so worried about and everything. Yeah, I don't know. Like he he seems to get through to people in a way that previous Italian leaders haven't, or like in the recent past haven't. Um, he can tap into the way, let's say, the average Italian thinks, but he's just, I don't know. I when I see something like this, I do respect political craftsmanship and being crafty and being intelligent, and this just wasn't crafty. It
yeah,
was clumsy.
yeah. I definitely
Yeah.
agree in retrospect, and it is a shame, and it actually does shake my confidence in him a lot. And like I said, he
Mm.
needs somebody with him that can take him to the side and say, you want to rethink this. And like I said, whether that's someone in
Yeah.
his own party, whether that's brothers, whether that's the more right wing faction of Five Star, who knows? But beyond that, like I said, I still see elections Italy at least being called before the end of the year. Maybe elections will take place beginning of 2020. Aside the point, but last thing I wanted to cover was German state elections, in which we had quite the shocking age gap. So most people 18 to 29, and the states that were really the big ones. The big one everyone talked about was Saxony. The young people either supported the ADF or the Green Party, whereas the boomers were supporting either the CD or the Social Democrats. So even like in East Germany, in the East, you had even the older people voting for the center left, center right uh, axis, if you will. So I think it's interesting that we're finally seeing. I mean, we've seen this boiling under the surface, and as time goes on in Germany, but I think it's really picking up steam with that, and a lot of people, I think, especially after the underperformance of the ADF in the European Parliament elections. I think for them, last Sunday was a very good morale booster, if you will.
Mm.
All right, that's all I had. Do you guys have anything else?
I could go a little bit more about Germany, but it would just me be blowing off hot air at that point. But yeah, so definitely quite the episode. I think a proper title would be Emperor Macron, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. Emperor Macron with a question
Yeah,
mark at the
we'll
end.
give Macron his due.
Chad, how about Chad Macron Virgin Virgin Salvini.
Oh boy.
You know what's funny is GSP sent us that his message from the Kremlin
Oh
that
yeah,
Macron was
correct.
listening to our show.
Mm.
So
We are officially
maybe GSP has some intel,
we are
but
officially a non-state
we're not
intelligence
privy.
actor. We're like WikiLeaks.
Mm.
Okay, man, we're gonna get arrested and put into a place like Assange.
Well, you know what? I've always wanted to meet Assange. Yeah, I'm going to end this before I incriminate us further. So this is the last episode of the War Report. I think it was a pretty good one. And we'll see you in I don't know 5 to 10 years, and after I'm $250,000 in debt.
Oh
I don't know. I think those are the
no,
charges for it, but or after I get out of my CIA reprogramming. I don't know what they're doing. But point being is probably not going to end well for me. Knock on wood. And I end
oh,
it there.
hold on, hold on.
Okay,
So
okay.
next week we might have Ryan Dawson on the show. So be on the lookout for that. We'll talk to him some more. We'll work something out with his schedule. So hopefully we can have him on the show. Because other Twitter users have pointed out that outside of Ryan Dawson and this show, no one else seems to be as confident about how precarious Israel's military situation is. So hopefully we can bring Ryan on to talk about that. But FZ, thank you so much for filling in while GSP has been on his training. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And anytime, whenever, even when GSP's back, we'll have you back on.
Yeah, I'll kick myself off. So keep
All
it
right,
free in
boys.
operation.
Thanks.
Oh, I think he dropped
Yeah.
out.
All right. Thank you.
But just in closing, knock on wood, and we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.